Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it's been a tremendous honor to be here. It is a tremendous honor to be here, and it's been a tremendous conference so far. Thank you for inviting me. I've been thrilled to hear all of the speakers this morning, and our panel also realizes that we are the first thing after lunch, so we will attempt to make it as engaging as the previous remarks have already been. As discussed, I'll stay away from the scarf. My name is Phillips. I drove ships in the Navy for 31 years. Upon retiring, I did get involved in the Intergovernmental Pilot Project in Hampton Roads as a volunteer. I found the issue compelling because it answered two questions for me that I had bothered me since I first arrived in Hampton Roads. The first was, why do I live in a city that's not in a county? And the second was, why, whenever it rains, does the whole place submerge around here? I'm from Annapolis, I'm from the Chesapeake Bay, but the topography in Hampton Roads is completely different. Those two things turn out to be the heart of the issue. Virginia is a Dillon rule state, which means that there is no home rule. The cities may only collaborate, they derive their power expressly and independently from the state, through the state government, and they may only collaborate in any formal way in formats or in organizations that the state government has specifically authorized for them to do. So if they decide to do a formal MOU and the state government has not authorized it, they cannot do it. This is a problem. This is why we have a lot of independence going on in the state of Virginia, not just in Hampton Roads, everywhere. It really impacts economic development, healthcare, all kinds of other things. But to the national security issue, that is the real challenge with Hampton Roads, and I'd like to talk first, before I get into that, as an example of how the Defense Department views this, what actions they are trying to take, what they have taken, things they are continuing to do, and why that matters, and hopefully why it will continue. First of all, DoD takes this seriously. They view it as an operational risk, an impediment to their ability to be resilient, to train, to operate, not only within the continental United States, but also in projecting power and executing our nation's goals and missions overseas. So they take it seriously. It creates real operational risk and instability. And Secretary Mattis has been quoted as saying this. Secondly, the Defense Department understands that it cannot do this or solve this problem alone. Secretary Mattis has been on record as saying that we will do our part. But to actually tackle and adapt and mitigate, this requires really a whole of society approach. Certainly within the federal government, a whole of government approach. The Defense Department can't do it alone. But they will make decisions based on scientific fact and engineering fact. They will accept science, and they will move forward based on what science is telling them they can expect in the context of resilience. They'll keep going back to that because that is what allows them to take whatever action they need to take to be able to move forward and try to steer clear of the political nuances and winds of it's climate change, it's sea level rise, it's you're exaggerating. Nope, this is resilience. This is what we need to do to be able to operate on a range in extreme temperatures, to be able to prepare ourselves to operate in the Arctic, as an example, another example of a new area where we will find ourselves in the very near future and where we have really limited experience outside of our submarine force within the Navy. Finally, the Defense Department really has an inherent responsibility to prepare. They understand that they have to take advantage of understand the risks that are coming, but also take advantage of the unprecedented foresight that we have in the current age with the science and the data that we have to move forward and to prepare themselves as an entity to be able to execute their mission. So in those three contexts, I would offer that the DoD does take this seriously. Since in the current administration, 12 defense officials and counting, senior officials, starting with Secretary Mattis, have acknowledged in written or oral testimony that they believe climate impacts national security, that they understand that it's man-made, and that they believe action must be taken. The combatant commanders, most recently AFRICOM, General Waldhauser, talked about how the increasing desertification of the Sahel area was causing migratory peoples who live there to have to change their patterns and gives them less space to graze their herds because there's less and less grass and more sand. This is creating instability in the region, and that instability is an issue for the AFRICOM command because they have reasons that they need to operate in that theater and work with those governments. So it's a kind of a transitioning sequence of events, not a direct line, but an indirect line to challenges that we are facing around the world, and we realize this. really, the DoD's perspective goes back as far as maybe 2003. Earlier today, someone mentioned studies done by the Center for Naval Analysis in 2007 and 2014 that called out climate as a threat magnifier, a threat multiplier. They don't, it may not be the only threat, but it certainly makes threats that are there worse and more challenging to deal with. And so this, again, forces the Department of Defense to have to think about this and take it seriously. In the context of this slide, most recently, in February, it might have been February 14th, Senators Inhofe and Kaine, Senator Kaine from Virginia, Inhofe from Oklahoma, were taking really a maintenance and a readiness update from the 4 service vice chiefs. And Senator Kaine asked each of them how their services were preparing for climate impact. Interestingly, Senator Inhofe said nothing, so the line of questioning continued. And the services in particular, the VC&O, Bill Moran, called out the Naval Academy's partnership with the city of Annapolis and with their scientific department as an example of studying this issue in one particular area. That's the Academy during 2003. I'm not sure personally that I would call the Naval Academy the most vulnerable piece of real estate that the Navy has to worry about, but the fact that they're working on it is promising. More to the point, the Marine Corps called out Parris Island as an area of great concern from them. South Carolina, coastal, extremely low. The fact that the Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps was willing to say that he'd taken 2 briefs in 8 months on what they were going to do about Parris Island and sea level rise and flooding in that area, to me, means the Marine Corps is taking it seriously. I think if you asked that question 5 years ago, you would not have gotten any response, let alone one more detailed response. So there is progress. Other things on this first slide, Kwajalein, which is kind of right here behind Mark. Some of you may have heard of this particular facility in the middle of the South Pacific on the Kwajalein Atoll. It's commonly referred to as a space fence. If you look it up in news media, you'll find it described in that regard. This is started in 2015, $1.5 billion project, and is called out not only in federal legislation at this point, but at least certainly in the press as well, because while it took into account seismic activity and wind in its construction, and in spite of the Marshallese government repeatedly informing the U.S. we needed to think about sea level rise was not taken into account in building and constructing this facility. So we have a $1.5 billion early warning radar facility that we spent a lot of money on in the middle of the South Pacific. It still hasn't officially formally come online. It finishes up this year, 2018. And it will be almost unusable, it is anticipated, within 20 to 25 years. And that's open source news coverage. So we spent all this money on something, and yet we ignored an aspect of climate change, and we're going to pay the price over time. The slide on the top corner is something that you may find interesting if you're just curious about sea level rise in particular. Virginia Institute of Marine Science has started a program where they do report cards, and they take each of the NOAA sea level tidal level gauges and do a specific review of that data from 1969 to the present, using 1987 as a center, because 1987 was a year that we began to see an acceleration in global warming and sea level rise as a result. What they're finding is if you take a linear projection for the Hampton Roads area, and this is the Sewell's Point tide gauge, which is right on Norfolk Naval Station, Pier 6, it's been there for 100 years, you might expect about 11 inches an additional sea level rise by 2050. However, if you look at the acceleration data, that's more like 19 inches. So that is a tremendous, I don't want to say a tremendous acceleration, that is a significant acceleration from what we have been expecting in the region. The region has experienced 18 inches of sea level rise in the last 100 years, but taking all the different time frames into account for that, it's going to experience another 18 in about 50 years. From when that data was started. So that's a big change for us. And the challenge for the region is sea level comes, but it never leaves. And so you're dealing with an ever-increasing presence of water. The reason Hampton Roads is so interesting from a national security perspective is, as a crucible for this challenge, is we are a water-based region. 1.7 million people, 17 cities and municipalities in the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. 65% of the people live in one city and work in another. 37% of the economy is based on federal presence. 29 separate federal entities are represented. Of them, 2/3 are DoD, and 3/4 are DoD, and 2/3 of that is Navy, mostly Navy. There are unique facilities here that don't exist anywhere else in the country. Newport News Shipbuilding, Huntington Ingalls, large shipbuilding business, defense industrial complex, only aircraft carrier construction facility, the only aircraft carrier refueling facility, one of 2 submarine construction facilities in the country, all in Hampton Roads. Also the largest naval station in the world, arguably. There's a picture of it there. 5th largest container port on the East Coast. It's actually 4 separate ports. It doesn't show up terribly well in the middle, but that's what that is. Very industrial waterfront along the Elizabeth River there. That's what you're looking at. So huge reliance on the largest coal export point, for good or ill. It's the largest coal export point on the East Coast. Lots of agricultural products leaving, lots of commodities coming in, waterfront, beach, tourism, a significant part of the economy in the region as well, and of course waterfront property. The house up here you see is maybe a little too close to the water. That's taken during Hurricane Matthew. It's Norfolk, Surrey Crescent, an area in Larchmont, where if you have an opportunity to go, you'll see houses at all different levels based on what FEMA required at the time that they were raised. So some are 8 feet, some are 10 feet, some are 14 feet. There's one little tiny ranch that looks like it's up in an eagle's nest. But the challenge is, and many of you have talked about this already this morning, these people can't sell their property. Their only choice is to raise it. The city could have bought them out, but they didn't. If you compile all the money that's been spent raising these houses that are not marketable, by the way, once they're raised, for exactly that reason, you still can't get to them. You still can't get in and out. You might think again about whether or not buying out property is a good idea or a bad idea. But the region has a water-based economy and a huge, huge federal presence. So all of these cities together, all of these people that support the federal presence there, all live in this region, and they all have to travel throughout it every day to get to work. We are experiencing water at an ever-increasing rate in the region. Just to make this a little bit more of a point, the federal facilities predominantly are shown in blue there, light blue. The chart on your right is an elevation chart. So it's not a surging seas diagram, it's strictly elevation. The buff color is above 3 meters. Every other color is something below 3 meters. And you can see the purple, blue, and magenta are all marsh and wetlands areas. So you can see if you look at where all the federal facilities are and where all the low areas are, they're in the same areas. So they're all at great risk, which of course is part of our challenge. Bases are cut in half by flooding routinely. Base access roads are routinely impacted. And the challenge, of course, for DOD and for the federal facilities is, how do we know what's happening? How do we plan proactively? Our first speaker this morning talked about predictive flood mapping. We aren't doing that, and even DOD isn't actually doing that. We base our planning on a 20-year installation master plan, which may not be far enough into the future. And really, our life revolves around the POM cycle, a 6-year budget cycle. Beyond that, we don't have a great capacity to predict or plan. Not that we don't have strategic planning, we absolutely do, but things only happen when there's money against them. And so if you don't have a process to look downrange, use predictive strategies, change your traditional practices, which are all, based on the past being the same as the present, we're not going to get ahead of this. And that's one of DOD's challenges that really is a similar challenge to what's impacting the local communities. Another challenge for the Department of Defense, I think Mark will talk some about this, is we have very little legal way to directly work with a city or municipality on funding a project that impacts the base ability to operate and become resilient that doesn't touch the fence line. So Hampton Roads Boulevard is an example. You drive down that road, it floods often. When it floods, people can't get to the base. It's a major base access. But because the flooding area is not directly at the base, there's really no way for the Department of Defense right now to help the city of Norfolk figure out solutions for that and make a change. So how can we influence legislation to give federal agencies and DOD in particular, in this case, more ways that they can work directly with local governments to help fund such projects? There are a number of things that might be useful tools, Defense Access Road Program and others, but somehow we've got to be able to get to this. Back to the larger context, things are happening. The Department of Defense last year finished a selected vulnerability study where it looked at 3,600 facilities and asked them to identify 6 different climate impacts and whether or not they were impacted by any or all of them, including drought, including water shortages, extreme temperatures, hot or cold, water from flooding, water from rain. And of the 3,600, fully 50% came back and said they had some problem. Now, this was a completely subjective study. It was qualitative, not quantitative. When you look at this map, this is the facilities that said they had a problem. When you look at the same chart of the facilities that said they didn't have a problem, an awful lot of the dots are in almost all the same places, which is the challenge with a qualitative, subjective study. Another interesting data point, the top two most impacted, I guess you would say, topics or areas of importance for the facilities were airfield operations and transportation and logistics. At the very bottom of the list were things that were least impacted were logistics and supply operations. So if your transportation systems and your airports are the most impacted, it's not really possible for logistics and supply not to be impacted. But if you're not looking at it long term and you don't have the right kind of data, maybe you haven't made that connection. So the good news is DoD knows it needs to do more, and they're starting to get a sense about what's happening to them. The challenge is, how do you quantify it? Legislation in this year's NDAA, submitted by Representative Langevin from the state of Rhode Island, Section 335, if anybody cares to look, directs that each of the services will identify their top 10 most vulnerable facilities to climate impact, any climate impact, and then come up with a 20-year quantified plan for what mitigation strategies they need to put into effect. So what are you going to do, and how are you going to pay for it, and what is it going to cost? They've also directed the combatant commanders to explain how their operations are being impacted by climate, and also how things like humanitarian assistance, disaster response, defense support to civilian authorities are being impacted by climate impact, and what kind of cost they are anticipating there, and how that will impact their ability to execute their mission in the future. So there's some hope. This is a one-year study, kind of unclear how the services are going to work it. Now that we have an appropriations bill, they actually can start moving. But we'll see. We'll see what the outcomes are. So at least there is some action. By the way, that was a bipartisan vote in the House and the Senate to get that passed. And there was legislation to overturn it, submitted by a congresswoman from Pennsylvania, and a bipartisan vote voted that legislation down. So interesting that in this administration, bipartisan legislation has directed the Defense Department to look at climate as an impact and identify it. I'm doing great if I have 2 minutes left. So I put the slide in there of the Air Force Academy in Boulder just because it's not just all water. I live in the place where the water's the problem, and I spend a lot of time thinking about water, but it's not just water. Huge fire challenges are also impacting us, and I talked earlier about the global challenges, but I put in Lake Chad as an example of a region where we have 23,000 kilometers of lake is now 1,300 kilometers of lake. The people who were once lived on islands in that lake have been displaced. They are now dealing across 4 countries with farmers who don't have a place for them in their society. We see governance challenges. What has happened? Bad actors have appeared, Boko Haram and others. So now in Central Africa, in an area that was once critical, and it is still critical, for the continent as a whole, we see more and more breakdown in law and order and more challenges as different countries try to understand, contain, deal with migration of peoples, deal with inability to grow crops, plus the loss of native species and all kinds of other challenges. So this is one example of something that AFRICOM cares greatly about. Cape Town is the other. I've personally become kind of obsessed with what's happening there. It was mentioned earlier this morning, but they're experiencing an extreme drought. Recently, as a month ago, they were ready to cut off all the water on what they were calling 0 day, which was looking like it was going to be April 16th or 22nd. They now expect more rain, so they have not gone to a 0 day, full cutoff for everybody. But here we have a first world city, a beautiful place, a modern city and country, a Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities city, with all the help that comes with that, an award-winning city for its water management, with a drought. And so what will the challenges be in a city? I mean, the city was very concerned that they would not be able to maintain law and order. And there's discussion that, it's interesting, it's the great equalizer. It's not the great equalizer. There's a largely white wealthy population. There's a largely minority not wealthy population. The city is allowing people who can afford it to bring in water and store it in tanks in their yards or to drill wells. That has really given them the flexibility to back off on this 0 day. But still, who can afford to buy water? Who can afford to drill wells? Wealthy people. So we still have an environmental justice problem in a first world city, in a first world country. So it's a fascinating challenge of what's coming for us in other places in the world in our future. And I have never been to Cape Town, so I can't be an expert on the ground there, but just watching the coverage and watching the challenges, even with all the help they've had, you know, they have a single source of water, it's reservoirs. When they dry up, they're toast. They're out of luck. So now they're looking at other challenges, but over time, what's going to happen here? I think it's a fascinating study, and I hope that some of you are studying it both from a business case, but also from a social engineering and a social justice case. And I'll stop talking.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.